The first thing Emma Collins noticed was the sound. Not a cry, not a scream, but laughter, soft and intimate, drifting through the frosted glass of the private maternity wing. She stood frozen in the corridor of the Boston Medical Center, one hand resting instinctively on her 7-month pregnant belly, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and instinct. Inside the room, her husband Daniel Wright was rocking a newborn baby in his arms, his face undone by a tenderness Emma had not seen directed at her in years. The woman smiling up at him from the hospital bed was not his wife. It was Lauren Brooks, his assistant. In that instant, something in Emma broke not loudly, not violently, but cleanly, like glass snapping under perfect pressure. Emma had imagined many betrayals in the abstract way faithful wives sometimes do late at night when silence grows teeth. None of them looked like this. Daniel's shoulders were relaxed, his voice low, reverent, as if the world had narrowed to the child against his chest. Lauren laughed again, her fingers brushing his sleeve, possessive and sure. They looked like a family. Emma did not step forward. She did not gasp or clutch the wall. She turned slowly, the echo of their voices following her down the hall, and walked away with measured steps, as nurses and doctors passed her without a second glance. To them, she was just another pregnant woman. No one saw the empire collapsing quietly inside her. She drove back to the penthouse in Back Bay with the radio off, the city lights blurring through her windshield. The building's doorman greeted her by name, smiling warmly, unaware that the ground beneath her marriage had split open. Upstairs, the apartment was immaculate, all marble counters and curated, calm, the kind of space meant to project success. Emma stood in the foyer and caught her reflection in the mirror. At 32, she looked older than she had a year ago, the softness in her eyes dulled by months of loneliness she had refused to name. She had built this life brick by brick, though no one ever gave her credit for it. Daniel was the visionary, the press said. Daniel was the genius. Emma was just the quiet wife who stayed home. She had let them believe that because it was easier, because love she thought once was more important than recognition. The silence of the apartment pressed in on her as memories surfaced uninvited. Daniel, at 38, brilliant and hungry when she met him, an architect with ambition but no capital. Emma had seen his potential when no one else did. She had funded the firm through family trusts, purchased controlling interest under layers of legal anonymity, and placed Daniel in the spotlight where he belonged. She hated the spotlight. He loved it. It had felt like a fair trade. Somewhere along the way, gratitude curdled into entitlement, and entitlement into contempt. Emma remembered the way Daniel's eyes slid past her now, when she spoke the way he dismissed her questions as nesting nerves, pregnancy fog, things women felt when they were no longer useful. She had absorbed it all, quietly, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself love required patience. Standing alone in the penthouse, she understood how wrong she had been. Later that night, long after the city had settled into sleep, Emma lay awake with one hand over her stomach, feeling the steady movement of the child inside her. Her son kicked strong and insistent, as if reminding her she was not alone. Daniel did not come home. She did not text him. In the darkness, the scene from the hospital replayed again and again, but something else began to form beneath the hurt, something colder and sharper. Emma had not screamed because screaming would have given him power. She had not confronted him because confrontation was what he expected. What Daniel did not understand, what he had never bothered to learn, was that Emma Collins had never survived by reacting. She survived by observing, calculating, and waiting. And as the city breathed around her, Emma made a quiet decision that would change every life connected to hers. The silence Daniel mistook for weakness was not surrender. It was the opening move. By morning, Emma Collins moved through the penthouse like a guest in her own life. The sun spilled across polished floors indifferent and bright, illuminating the distance that had grown between her and Daniel long before the night at the hospital. Their marriage had not collapsed all at once. It had eroded quietly day by day through missed dinners, unanswered questions, and a growing imbalance of power disguised as ambition. Daniel used to look at Emma as if she were the ground beneath his feet. Now he looked past her, already thinking about the next meeting, the next deal, the next applause that waited somewhere beyond their walls. When Emma first met Daniel Wright, he was 33 and starving for recognition. His designs were bold, his confidence infectious, but his bank account told a different story. She had been drawn to his mind to the way he spoke about buildings, as if they were living things capable of shaping the souls of the people inside them. Emma never told him who she really was. She never mentioned the family trusts, the inheritance quietly sitting in her name, the companies her late father had built. She wanted to be chosen without the weight of wealth tipping the scales. Daniel fell in love with her warmth, her intelligence, the way she listened. Or at least, that was what she believed then. After they married, the shift happened so gradually, Emma almost missed it. She offered support when Daniel complained about lack of funding, about partners who did not see his vision. When he hesitated, she stepped in, arranging introductions, securing silent investments through legal buffers that kept her name invisible. Sterling Wright Architects rose quickly, rebranded, refined, and reshaped into a firm people admired. Daniel became its face, its voice, its hero. Emma sat in the background during galas and interviews, smiling politely while reporters ignored her. She told herself it was fine. She preferred quiet. She preferred substance over spectacle. She did not realize she was slowly teaching Daniel to forget who made his success possible. Pregnancy should have softened him. Instead, it hardened something in Daniel that Emma did not recognize. As her body changed, his patience thinned. He complained about stress, about pressure, about how much responsibility rested on his shoulders. When Emma tried to talk about the baby, about names or nurseries or fears she did not yet have words for, Daniel waved her off. He spoke of deadlines and contracts of investors who demanded his full attention. Once, when she reminded him that she was a shareholder too, he laughed and told her ownership on paper was not the same as running a company. Emma absorbed the insult without argument, though it lodged deep and sharp in her chest. The house grew quieter as Daniel stayed out later, came home smelling of expensive liquor and unfamiliar perfume, brushed past Emma's attempts at affection with practiced impatience. He stopped asking her opinion. He stopped explaining his decisions. In meetings, he referred to the firm as his creation, his legacy. Emma watched him transform into a man who believed his own mythology, who no longer saw partnership as equal but hierarchical. To Daniel, Emma had become a background detail, a wife whose value was emotional, domestic, and increasingly inconvenient. He did not see the danger in underestimating her. Men like Daniel rarely did. What Daniel never understood was that Emma's silence was not absence. It was presence without performance. While he spoke loudly and claimed credit, she listened and remembered. She knew every clause in the company charter because she had approved them. She knew every trust and structure because they existed to protect what mattered most to her. Emma had been raised to see power not as something announced, but as something held. She had learned from her father that the strongest person in the room was often the one no one noticed. Daniel mistook her restraint for submission, her patience for dependency, her love for blindness. On that second morning after the hospital, Emma stood by the window and watched the city wake below her, her reflection faint in the glass. Daniel's absence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like confirmation. The marriage she thought she was protecting had already been hollowed out, replaced by a version of Daniel who believed himself untouchable. Emma placed a hand over her stomach, steadying herself, and felt clarity settle where grief had been. She had given Daniel everything he needed to rise. What he did not realize was that she had never given him the ground beneath her feet. Daniel left before dawn on Saturday, moving through the penthouse with quiet efficiency, the kind of efficiency that comes from habit rather than care. He told Emma he was flying to a leadership retreat in Colorado, a weekend of networking and strategy with potential investors. He kissed her forehead without looking at her eyes and promised to call when he landed. Emma watched him pack, noting the passport, the tailored coat, the faint scent of a perfume that did not belong to her. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt strangely still, as if it were holding its breath alongside her. Emma had never been the kind of wife who checked itineraries or questioned receipts. Trust to her had always been an active choice, not a passive assumption. But the image from the hospital would not loosen its grip, and intuition pressed harder than fear. She sat at the kitchen island with her laptop open, one hand wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, and logged into the shared cloud account she and Daniel used for household logistics. The screen filled with documents and confirmations, all neatly organized, all telling a story Daniel assumed she would never read. There was no flight to Colorado, no boarding pass, no hotel confirmation, no conference registration. Instead, Emma found a recurring charge tied to the firm's corporate account, billed discreetly under administrative expenses. A private maternity suite. A long-term reservation. The name of the hospital made her stomach tighten. The same medical center she had walked through the night before. Her pulse stayed steady as she scrolled her mind, shifting from disbelief to focus. This was not a mistake. It was a pattern. Her phone vibrated against the counter. An unknown number. The message was short, stripped of emotion. He is not in Colorado. He is at the hospital room 404. You deserve to know who he is building a family with. Emma stared at the screen for a long moment, then locked the phone and stood. She did not cry. Tears belonged to moments when the truth was still uncertain. This was clarity. She pulled on a coat, grabbed her keys, and called a rideshare instead of the driver Daniel insisted on using. Visibility felt dangerous. Invisibility felt strategic. The maternity wing was quiet in the way money buys silence. Soft lighting, muted voices, floors polished to a reflection. Emma walked slowly, her steps measured oversized sunglasses, hiding eyes that burned but did not break. When she reached room 404, the door was not fully closed. A narrow gap revealed a slice of the life Daniel had been living without her. She stopped, breath shallow, listening. The baby cried softly, then settled. Daniel's voice followed low and warm, filled with affection Emma barely recognized. Lauren laughed, teasing intimate. Emma leaned closer the edge of the door, pressing into her palm. She saw Daniel seated beside the bed, the newborn cradled against his chest, his expression open and proud. Lauren watched him like this was the future she had already claimed. Then the conversation shifted, and with it the final illusion Emma had been holding on to shattered. Lauren asked when he would tell his wife. Daniel sighed, still rocking the baby, and said timing was everything. Emma was emotional, he said. Her name was on early documents. If he moved too soon, things would get complicated. He talked about papers he had prepared a transfer framed as tax protection before the baby arrived. Lauren pouted, asking what would happen to Emma's child. Daniel dismissed the question with a shrug, saying he would give Emma the house and move on. He spoke of real heirs, of fresh starts, of a wife who had let herself go. Emma felt something inside her go cold and clear. This was not just betrayal. It was theft calculated and patient, wrapped in charm and paperwork. He was not planning to leave her. He was planning to strip her of control first. For a brief moment, anger surged hot and wild, a vision of bursting through the door, of shattering the scene with truth and screams. But Emma saw beyond the impulse. She saw the narrative Daniel would spin. The hysterical pregnant wife. The unreliable witness. He would win that version of the story. Instead, Emma lifted her phone and took a photograph through the gap, the image sharp and undeniable. She recorded his voice 10 seconds of carelessness that would cost him everything. Then she stepped back, heels silent against the carpet, and walked away without being seen. In the elevator, as the doors slid shut, Emma made her first call. Not to Daniel, to the past. To the man who had taught her that power was something you prepared, not something you demanded. The game had revealed itself. And Emma was done pretending she did not know how to play. Emma Collins did not go home to collapse. She went home to prepare. The penthouse greeted her with the same curated calm, but it no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a stage set beautiful and hollow, waiting to be dismantled. She placed her coat on the chair, set her phone on the table, and stood very still, letting the shock settle into something usable. Pain had weight, but it also had shape, and Emma had learned long ago how to carry heavy things without letting them slow her down. She did not pace, she did not rage. She opened her laptop and began to work. The evidence came together quickly because Daniel had never imagined she would look. He believed her trust was permanent, unconditional, a resource he could draw from endlessly without replenishing. Emma photographed the documents she found in his briefcase, the ones framed as harmless tax adjustments but worded carefully enough to shift control. She reread clauses she had approved years ago now, seeing how he intended to weaponize ignorance. Each discovery sharpened her focus. This was not the unraveling of a marriage. This was the exposure of a strategy, and strategies could be countered. That night, long after the city lights dimmed, Emma made a call she had not made in years. Robert Hayes answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar, grounding. He had been her father's attorney, then hers the keeper of family history and quiet safeguards. When Emma told him she needed to invoke the bad faith clause in the original agreements, he did not ask why. He only asked how soon she could meet. In his pause, she heard recognition. Whatever Daniel had done, Robert understood its weight immediately. Men like him always did. They met the next morning in Robert's office, a space that smelled faintly of old paper and polished walls lined with framed documents that marked victories no one had ever read about in the news. Emma sat across from him, one hand resting on her stomach posture straight, despite the fatigue threading through her bones. She laid out the facts without drama. The affair, the child, the plan to strip her of control before leaving her with a house and a story he could spin. Robert listened without interruption, his expression darkening not with surprise, but with something closer to offense. When she finished, he leaned back and nodded once. He told her she had done exactly the right thing by waiting. Waiting became Emma's discipline. She did not confront Daniel when he returned, did not let her face betray the storm beneath. She spent the weekend packing essentials, quietly moving personal documents and original incorporation files into secure storage under her maiden name. She read every page Robert sent her, memorizing timelines, contingencies, leverage points. Each step stripped fear from the equation and replaced it with structure. This was not revenge. This was correction. Daniel had violated trust law and contract, and Emma intended to respond in kind with precision. When Daniel came home Sunday evening exhausted and self-important, Emma watched him perform concern and familiarity like an actor who believed his own script. He spoke of travel delays and difficult investors of pressure she could never understand. When he mentioned the papers he needed her to sign, framing them as protection for their growing family, Emma smiled and agreed without hesitation. The relief on his face was almost insulting. He believed compliance was her nature. He believed pregnancy had softened her judgment. He did not see the calculation behind her eyes. Later, that night alone again, Emma stood by the window and watched the city pulse below. Her reflection stared back calmer than she felt, stronger than she had ever allowed herself to be. She thought of her father, of the lessons he had taught her without ever needing to say them aloud. Power did not announce itself. It waited, it prepared. It struck when the outcome was inevitable. Daniel thought he was moving pieces on a board Emma did not understand. What he did not know was that she had designed the board to find the rules and decided who was allowed to play. The woman he dismissed as quiet had already stepped out of the role he wrote for her, and the game, finally revealed, was no longer his to control. Emma Collins made her move on Monday morning, not with drama, but with paperwork. While Daniel stormed out of the penthouse convinced he was still in control, she walked into the marble lobby of the private bank her family had used for generations, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. The accounts Daniel relied on, the ones he assumed were shared equally by marriage and habit, were not as simple as he believed. The original capital had come from Emma's trusts layered carefully through entities designed for protection, not romance. With Robert Hayes on the line and biometric authorization completed, Emma did not drain the accounts. That would have been emotional. Instead, she froze them with surgical precision, flagging every transaction above a modest threshold for dual approval. The machine Daniel depended on ground to a halt without a sound. From the bank, Emma went straight to the firm's headquarters for the first time in years. Sterling Wright Architects occupied a glass tower downtown, its lobby dominated by sleek models, and Daniel's name etched prominently on the wall. The receptionist barely looked up when Emma entered, mistaking her for another expectant wife with time to kill. Emma did not correct her. She walked past with quiet authority and asked for the chief financial officer. When security hesitated, an older guard recognized her immediately, his posture shifting with respect that came from memory rather than instruction. Emma had learned long ago that loyalty lasted longer than branding. The meeting with the chief financial officer lasted 3 hours. He was a nervous man, competent, but cornered, the kind of professional who survived by following louder voices. Emma did not raise hers. She laid out documents he had hoped no one would ever connect: consulting fees, routed through shell companies, payments that matched the timing of Lauren's apartment purchase, the car, the hospital suite. When Emma mentioned the company name tied to those transactions, the man's composure cracked. He admitted everything quickly, explaining that Daniel had pressured him, threatened his job, dismissed concerns as temporary loans. Emma listened without satisfaction. This was not about humiliation. It was about record. By the time Emma left the building, she carried copies of every illicit transaction Daniel had made over the past 2 years. The scope was larger than she had expected, but not more offensive. Daniel had not just betrayed her. He had stolen from the firm her father built, from partners who trusted him, from employees whose futures depended on stability. Emma understood then that the narrative would not be about a marriage gone wrong. It would be about leadership and accountability. That was a language boards and courts respected. That night, Emma did not return to the penthouse. She checked into a discreet hotel under her maiden name, her phone lighting up steadily as Daniel's world began to fracture. Missed calls, demands, confusion sharpening into anger. She read none of it in full. One message stood out, sent with unfiltered panic, asking why his cards were being declined at a client dinner. Emma typed a single response, calm, and measured, telling him she was somewhere honesty lived. Then she turned off her phone and let the silence do its work. Daniel had never been denied before. That was his weakness. By Tuesday morning, his confidence had curdled into fury as he stood alone in the penthouse, shouting at voicemail and convincing himself Emma was throwing a tantrum. He refused to consider the alternative that she knew everything. He believed secrecy was permanent if guarded carefully enough. He did not understand that Emma's power had never come from visibility. It came from structure, from systems he never bothered to examine, because he assumed they belonged to him by proximity. While Daniel unraveled, Emma sat with Robert Hayes in his office, reviewing forensic reports and legal timelines. She felt tired, but it was the clean exhaustion of purpose, not despair. Her child shifted inside her steady and strong, grounding her to the future she was protecting. Robert warned her about public fallout, about reputations and headlines about how the world loved men like Daniel until it didn't. Emma listened, then told him she did not intend to go to court yet. Courts were slow, boards were faster, and Daniel had already scheduled the stage for his own downfall. As she left the office, Emma paused on the sidewalk and looked back at the city skyline, steel and glass catching the afternoon light. Daniel believed he was a builder. He believed structures existed because of him. What he never understood was that Emma had designed the foundation beneath everything he touched, and foundations once reclaimed decided what stood and what collapsed. Daniel Wright had never known what it felt like to be powerless. His life had been a steady climb, each door opening because he believed it should. So when the card reader at a private client dinner flashed, declined for the third time, the sensation that rose in his chest was not embarrassment at first, but confusion. He laughed it off, made a joke about banking errors, promised reimbursement, but the smiles around the table tightened. Reputation, he knew, was a fragile thing. By the time he left the restaurant, his confidence had cracked into something sharper and more dangerous: panic. Tuesday morning found him alone in the penthouse, the silence oppressive. He slammed his phone onto the marble counter after another unanswered call. Emma was not home. Her closet was half empty. Jewelry was gone, documents missing. Daniel paced the floor, telling himself she was being dramatic, hormonal, overwhelmed. That explanation had always worked before. It had to work now. The alternative that Emma knew what he had done was unthinkable. He had been careful. He had controlled the story, or so he believed. His phone buzzed. Lauren. The message was frantic. The realtor was calling. The deposit for the apartment had bounced. The listing was being pulled. Daniel swore under his breath and typed back reassurances he no longer felt. He dialed the firm's private banking line, demanding answers, invoking his title, his authority. The response on the other end was calm, rehearsed, devastating. The accounts were frozen due to suspected irregular activity. The freeze had been initiated by the primary holder. Daniel shouted that he was the chief executive officer, that he was the husband, that there had to be a mistake. The banker corrected him gently. His authorization was secondary. The line went dead. Secondary. The word echoed loud and ugly. For years, Daniel had believed himself indispensable. He had signed contracts, shaken hands, taken credit. Emma had let him. She had stood beside him, smiling, silent, reinforcing the illusion. Only now did it occur to him that illusion required consent. And Emma's consent had just been withdrawn. He needed her signature. He needed it immediately. Without it, everything he had built could be taken apart, piece by piece. Daniel tried to find her. Friends had not seen her. Her doctor's office informed him she had canceled future appointments. That detail struck him harder than the financial ones. A pregnant woman did not cancel care without a plan. Fear crept in cold and unwelcome. He rushed to his home office and logged into the company server searching for something familiar to anchor himself. Instead, he found an email marked urgent. The chief financial officer. External auditors. Questions about consulting fees tied to a shell company Daniel had created for Lauren. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He had not authorized an audit, or had he? He grabbed his keys and drove too fast, mind racing through contingencies. He could explain. He always explained. He had brought in revenue. He had grown the firm. Everyone benefited from his ambition. The auditors would see reason. Emma would calm down. This was temporary chaos, nothing more. That was the story he told himself as he sped through the city, ignoring the tremor in his hands. Across town, Emma Collins sat in a leather chair in Robert Hayes's office, listening as forensic accountants detailed the scope of Daniel's misconduct. The numbers were precise, unemotional, devastating. Millions redirected. Company funds used as personal leverage. Robert warned her that exposure would be brutal. The public adored Daniel. He was charismatic. Conviction would not come easily. Emma nodded, already thinking beyond courts and headlines. Daniel was not afraid of shame. He was afraid of losing control. That was where she would meet him. By late afternoon, Daniel was unraveling. His charm deserted him as colleagues avoided eye contact whispers, following him through halls he once commanded. His yes men grew quiet. His confidence thinned into desperation. He still believed he could talk his way out, that Emma would come home, that marriage meant forgiveness. He did not understand that Emma was no longer reacting to betrayal. She was responding to strategy. As night fell, Daniel sat alone staring at the city lights he once thought he owned. Somewhere, Emma was moving pieces he could not see. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, and he had no idea how far the fall would be. Friday morning arrived wrapped in steel-gray clouds, the kind that pressed low over the city and made even glass towers feel exposed. Daniel Wright walked into the boardroom early, dressed in his sharpest suit posture, rigid with forced confidence. He had barely slept, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, but he told himself exhaustion was temporary. Today would fix everything. The restructuring vote was scheduled. Emma would arrive, sign the papers, and restore order. He had rehearsed his speech, imagined the nods of approval, the quiet authority returning to his voice. Control, he believed, was only a signature away. The boardroom filled slowly. Longtime directors took their seats, men and women who had watched the firm grow from a promising local practice into a national name. Some had known Emma's father. Some remembered who truly owned the roots of this company, even if Daniel had encouraged them to forget. He greeted them with practiced charm, ignoring the way conversations hushed as he passed. When someone asked where his wife was, Daniel smiled tightly and said she would be joining them shortly, fully supportive of the firm's future. He needed them to believe that. He needed to believe it himself. At 5 minutes past the hour, the doors opened. Daniel turned, expecting to see Emma softened by apology, dressed in something forgiving, ready to smooth things over. Instead, she entered wearing a tailored black maternity suit that looked more like armor than clothing. Her hair was pulled back, her expression composed and distant. Behind her walked Robert Hayes, carrying a briefcase heavy with consequence, and the chief financial officer, pale and resolute. The room fell silent. Daniel felt something in his chest stutter. This was not the reunion he had imagined. Emma did not sit beside him. She took the chair at the opposite end of the table, the one reserved for the founding family. When Daniel laughed nervously and gestured for her to join him, she looked at him with eyes that held no warmth at all, and told him to sit down. It was not loud, it was not cruel, it was final. The board shifted attention, sharpening. Power, when reclaimed, was unmistakable. Daniel pushed the folder toward her, explaining again that the transfer was a formality, a gesture of stability, while Emma focused on motherhood. Emma opened it slowly as if reading for the first time, though she knew every line by heart. She lifted the pen, and Daniel felt hope surge despite everything. Then she tore the document cleanly in half. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. Papers fluttered to the floor. Daniel stood abruptly, voice rising, demanding to know what she was doing. Emma told him she was declining his offer and invoking her right as majority shareholder to call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the chief executive officer. Laughter broke from Daniel, sharp and disbelieving. He insisted she had no grounds that the board supported him, that this was personal hysteria dressed up as governance. Emma nodded once and signaled to Robert. The lights dimmed as the screen behind them came to life. The first image was not a spreadsheet. It was a photograph. Daniel holding a newborn in a private hospital room, Lauren smiling beside him. Gasps rippled through the room. Before Daniel could speak, the screen shifted to bank records, highlighted transfers, timelines that told a story of theft rather than ambition. Emma's voice remained steady as she listed violations, not with anger, but with clarity. Embezzlement, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Daniel tried to interrupt, shouting that this was a private matter, that none of it affected the firm. Emma corrected him calmly, explaining that company funds had paid for the apartment, the car, the hospital suite. She turned to the board and revealed what Daniel had never bothered to read. The firm was structured with two classes of shares. Voting power belonged entirely to Class A. Emma owned all of them. 90% of the total equity was hers. Daniel owned dividends only, and not enough to matter. He was not a partner. He was an employee. Silence consumed the room. Daniel's world collapsed in real time as hands rose around the table in favor of his removal. Even those he'd brought in loyal to his image rather than truth followed the inevitable. Security stepped forward. Daniel looked at Emma, searching for mercy, for regret, for anything familiar. She met his gaze once, briefly, and told him this meeting was over. As he was escorted out, stripped of title and illusion, Emma remained seated, breathing steadily, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. The game Daniel thought he controlled had ended, and Emma, finally seen, had already won. The aftermath unfolded quickly, brutally, as consequences often do when truth is no longer contained. Daniel Wright did not leave the building as a humbled man. He left furious, humiliated, stripped of the identity he had wrapped around himself for years. Within hours, he was driving too fast, chasing a future that had already closed its doors to him. The call came while Emma Collins was still in the boardroom, finalizing interim leadership decisions with steady clarity. Daniel had crashed his car on the highway, his desperation translating into recklessness. Lauren had been with him. There had been a car seat in the back. Emma arrived at the hospital with a strange calm settling over her, the storm already spent. Daniel survived the surgery, though his injuries were severe enough to end any illusion of a return. Lauren emerged shaken, furious, and frightened, clinging not to concern, but to loss. In the harsh light of the emergency ward, accusations spilled freely. Lauren screamed that Emma had ruined them, that Daniel had been driven to madness. Emma listened without interruption, her hand resting over her stomach, feeling the steady reassurance of life continuing, despite the wreckage around her. When the doctors confirmed that the baby in Lauren's care was unharmed, Emma felt relief sharper than any anger she had left. 3 days later, Emma visited Daniel once. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, bruised, and diminished, his leg-suspended machines humming softly where ambition once had. He reached for her hand with trembling fingers. Speaking of regret, of fear of love, rediscovered too late. Emma stood at the foot of the bed and told him she had brought papers. Not reconciliation. Divorce. His tears came quickly then, thick with disbelief, as she explained the legal reality he had ignored. The infidelity clause nullified any claim he might have made. There would be no support. No shared custody. She would seek sole guardianship, and the court would grant it. Daniel tried to argue then, to bargain, but Emma had already moved beyond the language he spoke. Before she left, Emma delivered the final truth without raising her voice. The baby Lauren claimed was his was not. Medical tests had confirmed it. Lauren had lied, choosing convenience over honesty, assuming Daniel's wealth would protect her. She had already left the city, slipping away when the accounts froze and the future vanished. Daniel stared at the ceiling as the weight of that revelation settled in, heavier than the crash, heavier than the prison sentence that would follow once charges were filed. Emma watched him break, not with satisfaction but with acceptance. This was not vengeance. This was consequence. 6 months later, the firm bore a new name, one that reflected its origins rather than its fallen figurehead. Under Emma's leadership, profits surged, confidence returned, and the market responded with enthusiasm. A strength, it seemed, inspired trust. Emma sat at the head of the boardroom table with her infant son nearby, his presence grounding her to what truly mattered. She was no longer invisible. She was respected not because of survival, but because of competence, clarity, and restraint. Robert Hayes kept Daniel's letters unopened as instructed. He worked quietly in prison, a man reduced to routine, haunted by the life he had traded for illusion. Lauren's name surfaced occasionally in whispers always attached to a new story, a new mark. Emma did not follow either narrative closely. Her focus belonged to the present, to the company she rebuilt, and the child she was raising with intention and care. On a quiet evening, Emma stood by the window of her office, city lights stretching endlessly below. She saw her reflection in the glass, no longer tired, no longer uncertain. She had not shouted, she had not begged. She had waited, learned, and acted when the moment demanded it. The silence she once used to protect love had become the silence of resolution. Emma Collins did not burn the world down in anger. She dismantled what no longer deserved to stand and built something stronger in its place. And in that quiet strength she found her future. From a professional perspective, Emma's story is not simply about betrayal or revenge. It is a case study in power dynamics, risk management, and emotional intelligence. She did not win because she was angrier, louder, or more ruthless. She won because she understood structure, timing, and leverage. In real life, true authority rarely belongs to the person who speaks the most or takes the credit. It belongs to the one who understands the system, anticipates outcomes, and acts without ego. Emma's silence was not passivity. It was strategic restraint, a skill often underestimated, especially in women, and one of the most valuable forms of leadership in any field. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories that explore power, resilience, and quiet strength beneath the surface. And now, one question for you. If you were in Emma's position, what would you choose? Comment below with just 2 words: quiet power.